The bite of morning frost sinks through the thin wool of your blanket, carrying the sharp scent of old wood ash. You open your eyes to a room, swallowed by the deep blues of pre-dawn darkness. Above you, the wind moves heavily across the wooden roof, finding every gap in the thatch and timber. The floorboards offer no warmth as you shift your weight, groaning under the sudden movement. You pull the heavy cloak tighter against your shoulders, feeling the rough fibers scratch against your skin. Outside, the rhythmic breathing of a resting ox drifts through the thin walls. This is the stillest hour, suspended between the frozen night and the coming day. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If stepping into these forgotten worlds helps you rest, consider subscribing for more. Settle into your space, unclenching your jaw and letting your shoulders drop. Allow the endless rush of your day to slip away. As we enter a small valley somewhere in the remnants of the Roman world, where the year is 600 and the world ends at the edge of the next forest, footsteps echo faintly from the neighboring house, a dull thud against packed earth. You reach for your leather shoes in the dark, your fingers brushing the stiff, cold material that has begun to wear thin at the heels. You slip them on, feeling the familiar pinch of the hardened leather against your ankles. The small knife at your belt clinks against a wooden bowl resting on the narrow table. You stand fully now, feeling the chill radiate from the ground, straight up through your legs. The silence in the room feels thick, broken only by your own measured breathing. Survival in places like this was never about comfort, only endurance. Smoke from yesterday's fire still clings to the rafters, of bitter aroma that never truly leaves the house. You strike a piece of flint over the stone hearth, watching the tiny orange sparks shower over a bed of dry moss. The first spark catches, sending a thin ribbon of grey smoke twisting toward the ceiling. You blow on it carefully, feeling the sudden heat push back against the biting cold of the room. The moss flares into a fragile flame, illuminating the rough-hewn walls and the worn tools hanging from wooden pegs. You feed small twigs into the growing fire, listening to the sharp crackle of dry bark catching alight. Warmth begins to spread outward in a small, tight circle. Before the sun even hints at rising, the village begins to stir. You step toward the heavy wooden door, lifting the iron latch with a metallic clatter that rings loud in the empty room. The air outside hits you like a physical weight, carrying the damp smell of frozen mud and decaying pine needles. You walk out into the narrow dirt track that serves as the main road, your shoes crunching over the frost-hardened ridges of wagon ruts. The sky above is a vast, empty dome of slate grey, devoid of any stars. Shadows cling to the edges of the thatched houses, hiding the true shape of the settlement. Have you ever noticed how quiet places feel louder at night? You pull your wool cloak tighter around your neck, burying your chin in the coarse fabric to escape the wind. You march toward the center of the village, following the familiar path by memory rather than sight. The great Roman highways have been crumbling for centuries, leaving only these muddy veins to connect isolated communities. You pass the remnants of an old stone wall, its once perfect blocks now choked with frozen ivy and moss. Your hand brushes the ancient masonry, feeling the icy, pitted surface of a forgotten empire. The world you know stops at the edge of the next forest, an unbroken wall of dark pines. Beyond that tree line lies nothing but rumor and empty distance. A wooden bucket swings loosely in your grip as you make your way toward the communal well. You approach the stone circle, hearing the faint splash of water echoing from deep within the earth. You lower the heavy oak bucket, listening to the hemp rope groan against the wooden winch. The cold air stings your knuckles as you grip the crank, turning it with a rhythmic squeak that carries across the empty square. You haul the water upward, feeling the sudden heavy resistance as it breaches the surface. The liquid sloshes over the rim, splashing onto your boots and sending a fresh spike of cold through the leather. In winters like this, every chore demanded a physical toll that the body simply absorbed. You carry the slushing bucket back up the slight incline, adjusting your balance as the water shifts. You spot a neighbor emerging from a low doorway, a dark silhouette against the graying horizon. He nods to you without speaking, his breath pluming in the freezing air like a ghost. You return the gesture, understanding the shared reluctance to open your mouth to the freezing wind. The isolation of this valley breeds a silence among its people, a mutual agreement to conserve energy for the work ahead. You push open your door, grateful for the modest warmth that the small hearth fire has finally generated. The flames now cast long, dancing shadows across the packed earth floor. Heat presses against your face as you set the water down near the stones. You dip a smaller wooden bowl into the bucket, taking a long drink of the metallic, freezing liquid. It chills your throat, instantly waking your senses more sharply than the morning air. You reach for a heel of dark bread wrapped in a cloth, tearing off a stiff piece with your hands. The bread is dense, tasting of rye and the faint dust of the millstone. You chew it methodically, feeling the rough texture scrape against the roof of your mouth. Hunger here is a constant companion, a dull ache that dictates the rhythm of the day. You grab a piece of salted pork from the hanging larder, slicing off a thin ribbon with your small iron knife. You drop the meat into a cast iron pot over the fire, listening to it instantly hiss and spit. The rich, savory smell of rendering fat fills the small room, masking the stale scent of damp wool. You stir the contents with a carved wooden spoon, watching the pork curl and brown in the heat. A meager breakfast, but enough to fuel the heavy labor that waits in the fields. You sit on a low stool, letting the fire warm your shins as you eat the hot meal. The crackle of the flames is the only sound in the enclosed space. Can you imagine finding peace in such a stark, demanding routine? Outside, the wind shifts direction, rattling the wooden shutters against their iron hinges. You finish the last of the food, scraping the wooden bowl clean and setting it aside. You wipe your greasy fingers on a scrap of cloth, the rough weave catching on your calloused skin. The grey light filtering through the cracks in the wall tells you the sun has finally breached the horizon. You gather your tools for the day, lifting an iron-tipped hoe from the corner. The metal is freezing to the touch, biting through your skin, even as you grip the wooden handle. You step back out into the morning, ready to face the frozen earth. You march toward the fields that stretch beyond the last houses, the brown earth waiting rigidly for spring. You walk the frozen rows, checking the condition of the soil where the winter wheat lies buried. Your boots break through the crust of frost, with every step leaving dark, jagged footprints in the white sheen. You kneel down, digging your bare fingers into the rigid dirt to inspect the moisture beneath. The soil is unforgiving, a solid block of ice and mud that refuses to yield. You stand back up, brushing the frozen dirt from your hands and watching it scatter in the wind. The work is slow but necessary, a silent pact made with the land. At this time, farming was not an occupation. It was the only barrier against starvation. A distant hammer rings 3 times the sharp metallic strikes echoing down from the village center. You turn your head, knowing the blacksmith has already fired his forge for the morning's repairs. You can almost smell the sulfur and coal dust carrying on the breeze, mixing with the scent of pine. You strike the ground with your hoe, breaking a clump of frozen weeds that threaten the dormant crops. The impact shudders up the wooden handle, vibrating through your forearms and into your shoulders. You swing again, finding a steady rhythm in the labor, a physical cadence that pushes the cold away. Sweat begins to prickle along your hairline despite the freezing temperature. You pause your work to catch your breath, leaning your weight against the sturdy handle of the hoe. You look across the valley, watching the pale morning light crawl down the sides of the forested hills. The trees stand like an impenetrable fortress, dark and dense, guarding the unknown world beyond. You have never seen a city with stone walls taller than these ancient oaks, and you likely never will. You wipe the sweat from your brow with the back of your hand, feeling the grit of the dirt against your skin. A flock of sparrows bursts from a nearby thicket, their wings beating frantically against the heavy air. They vanish into the grey sky, leaving the fields in absolute stillness once more. By mid-morning, the frost begins to retreat, turning the upper layer of soil into a thick, clinging mud. You trudge down the road, the heavy earth sticking to the worn soles of your leather shoes. You scrape your boot against the edge of your hoe, dislodging a thick clump of wet dirt. The wind has died down, leaving a stagnant, damp chill that settles deep into your bones. You hear the faint sound of a wooden cart rumbling over the distant dirt track, its ungreased axles whining in protest. You do not look up, knowing it is only a neighbor hauling firewood from the forest's edge. The isolation of the village means every sound is recognizable, every routine mapped out for generations. What would you do with a life so bound to a single piece of earth? You lift the iron tool again, striking the earth with renewed force to clear a patch of encroaching briars. You feel a thorn catch the sleeve of your wool cloak, tugging at the woven threads before snapping. You pull the broken branch free, tossing it onto a growing pile of debris at the edge of the field. The muscles in your back begin to ache, a familiar dull throb that you ignore out of habit. You focus purely on the square foot of ground in front of you, suiting out the vastness of the valley. You shrink, pull, and clear, letting the repetition numb your mind to the physical strain. The smell of turned earth rises around you, rich and dark and full of sleeping roots. The wooden handle of the hoe is polished smooth from years of friction against calloused palms. You run your thumb over a small notch near the baser mark left by your father when the tool belonged to him. You grip it tighter, feeling a strange connection to the hands that worked this same soil before you. You move to the next row, your breathing heavy and visible in the cold air. You spot a stone lodged deep in the mud, its pale surface stark against the dark dirt. You pry it loose with the iron tip, tossing it toward the boundary wall, where countless other stones have been thrown. A farmer's life here is measured in stones removed and weeds broken. You stand upright to stretch your aching spine, hearing the faint pop of a stiff joint in your lower back. You look toward the distant cliff face, where rumors say a monastery is carved directly into the rock. You have never been there, but the thought of men praying alone in the dark offers a strange kind of comfort. You imagine them sitting in cold stone cells, listening to the same wind that sweeps across your fields. You take a deep breath of the freezing air, letting it clear the dust from your lungs. The sky remains an unbroken canopy of grey, offering no warmth and no promise of a break in the weather. You turn back to the dirt, the brief moment of reflection over. Even in moments of quiet contemplation, the land never stops demanding attention. The sharp scent of crushed pine needles drifts from the forest edge, carried by a sudden gust of wind. You shiver as the chill cuts through the sweat, dampening your undertunic, reminding you of the freezing temperature. You swing the hoe with less force, now your arms growing heavy with the accumulated fatigue of the morning. You hear the distant braying of a mule, a harsh echoing sound that bounces off the valley walls. You drag the iron blade through the mud, carving a shallow trench to direct the spring runoff away from the seeds. The mud slops against your ankles, a wet, freezing embrace that seeps into your woolen socks. You grit your teeth, pushing through the discomfort. You decide to take a brief respite, walking over to the low stone boundary wall that circles the field. You sit on a flat, moss-covered rock, feeling the icy dampness seep through your cloak almost instantly. You reach into a small leather pouch at your belt, pulling out a handful of dried apples. You chew the tough, wrinkled fruit, letting the tart sweetness burst across your tongue. The flavor is a stark contrast to the bland rye bread from earlier, a small luxury hoarded for long work days. You watch a solitary crow circle high above the tree line, a black speck against the featureless sky. You follow its flight until it disappears behind the ridge, leaving you alone with the vast, quiet landscape. Footfalls approach from the village path, a rhythmic squelch in the softening mud. You turn to see the local priest making his way toward the next farm, his dark robes dragging through the dirt. He clutches a small wooden cross to his chest, his head bowed against the lingering chill of the morning. You offer a slight nod as he passes, a gesture of respect mixed with the inherent fear of judgment. You remember the sins you carry like quiet stones in your chest, the small failures and angers of a difficult life. You watch him fade down the track, a dark figure, swallowed by the grey surroundings. You wonder what salvation looks like when your entire world consists of dirt, frost, and unyielding labour. Can faith truly wash away the exhaustion of a life spent breaking the earth? You rise from the cold stone, brushing the damp moss from the back of your cloak with a heavy hand. You pick up the hoe, feeling the wood heavier now than it was at dawn. You walk to the far edge of the field, where the shadow of the forest keeps the ground perpetually frozen. You strike the earth here with maximum effort, the iron ringing against the hidden ice below the surface. The shock travels up your arms, jarring your teeth and sending a dull ache into your jaw. You refuse to let the cold defeat you, swinging the tool in a punishing rhythm. You break the frost, shattering the icy barrier into 1,000 muddy shards. The forest looms just beyond the boundary, a dense tangle of ancient oaks and towering pines. You can hear the branches creaking as they rub together in the wind, a sound like old wooden ship masts straining. You peer into the gloom between the trunks, seeing nothing but shadows and the occasional glint of frost. You know the stories of wolves and desperate men who hide in those depths, venturing out only when hunger forces them. You keep your distance, ensuring your work never takes you past the final marker stone. The safety of the village, no matter how harsh, is infinitely better than the unknown horrors of the wild. To these villagers, the forest was not nature to be explored, but a hostile border to be guarded against. You drag the iron blade through the freshly broken earth, smoothing the rough chunks into an even layer. You wipe a streak of mud from your cheek, feeling the rough grit smear across your cold skin. The morning is passing slowly, the light barely changing as the overcast sky traps the valley in a perpetual twilight. You listen to your own breathing, a ragged, measured sound that matches the swing of your arms. You find a deep satisfaction in the physical exhaustion, a tangible proof that you have earned the next meal. You move to the next patch of frozen weeds, raising the hoe high above your head. The cycle continues, unbreakable and endless. The metallic tang of blood touches your tongue as you inadvertently bite the inside of your cheek from the exertion. You spit a small red droplet into the dark soil, watching it vanish instantly into the mud. The wind picks up again, howling down from the northern ridge and tearing across the open field. You lean into it, using your body weight to anchor yourself against the sudden force. You pull your collar up, trying to shield your raw neck from the biting gale. The cold is a living thing out here, always searching for a way past your defenses. You tighten your grip on the wood, standing firm. You finish the final row of the morning, dropping the iron head of the hoe to the ground with a dull thud. You stand amidst the turned earth, surveying the dark, muddy expanse that you have wrestled from the frost. You feel a fleeting sense of accomplishment, a small victory in the ongoing war against starvation and the elements. You scrape the heaviest mud from your boots using a sharp stone, preparing to walk back to the village. You lift the tool onto your shoulder, its weight settling comfortably into the groove of your collarbone. You turn your back on the forest and begin the slow walk home. The village waits. In the distance, a cluster of smoking chimneys and grey thatched roofs. Smoke drifts lazily from the roof holes, hanging in the damp air like a tattered grey blanket over the settlement. You follow the narrow dirt track back toward your small house, your boots slipping occasionally in the worsening mud. You pass the blacksmith's forge again, feeling a wave of intense heat wash over you from the glowing coals. You hear the bellows groaning, a rhythmic wheezing sound that fuels the blinding white fire. You catch the scent of hot iron and burning hair, a sharp industrial smell in the middle of the natural valley. You keep walking, letting the heat fade as you return to the cold shadows of the residential path. In a world defined by the cold, a working forge was the closest thing to a miracle. You reach your wooden door, lifting the cold iron latch with a tired, heavy hand. You push it open, stepping out of the harsh wind and back into the dim, smoky interior of your home. You lean the hoe against the wall, the iron tip leaving a small smear of wet dirt on the packed earth floor. You unfasten your wool cloak, letting the heavy, damp garment slide from your shoulders and hang it on a peg. You step toward the hearth, holding your raw, freezing hands out toward the dying embers of the morning fire. You rub your palms together, feeling the dry, cracked skin snag as the warmth slowly returns to your fingers. The quiet of the house settles around you once more. Midday approaches without a change in the sky, the grey light holding steady through the cracks in the walls. You sit on the low wooden stool, letting the tension in your back ease slightly after the morning's labour. You stare into the glowing red coals, watching the delicate grey ash shift and crumble under its own weight. You listen to the silence of the room, feeling the heavy isolation of the enclosed space. You know the afternoon will demand just as much effort, but for now you sit perfectly still. You pull a piece of dry wood from the basket, tossing it onto the embers to build the heat. The world outside the wooden walls remains frozen and distant. You pull a frayed length of hemp rope from a woven basket near your feet, testing its stiff resistance between your calloused thumbs. The rough fibers shed a fine, pale dust that dances in the weak light filtering through the wall slats. Your wooden stool groans in protest as you lean forward, reaching for a cracked leather harness that needs mending before tomorrow's ploughing. The thick smell of tallow grease rises from the leather, masking the lingering scent of morning smoke that clings to your clothes. You press an iron awl into the hardened hide, twisting the handle deliberately until the metal bites through the tough surface. The work requires a measured rhythm, pulling the heavy twine through the newly made hole with a sharp, forceful tug. Outside, the midday sun remains hidden behind a solid ceiling of slate clouds, though the ambient light has taken on a flatter, more even quality. Shadows no longer stretch across the packed earth floor, but instead pool heavily directly beneath the wooden table and the narrow bed frame. A stray gust of wind whistles over the thatch roof, a low, hollow sound that reminds you of the vast emptiness of the valley. You thread the bone needle again, your fingers moving with a practiced efficiency born of endless repetition during the winter months. The harness leather is rigid from the cold, fighting stubbornly against your efforts to bind the ragged tear. Survival here meant mastering a dozen different trades simply because there was no one else to pay to do the work. You wrap the finished section of the harness around your wrist, pulling the final knot tight with a sharp grunt of effort. The repaired leather feels thick and heavy in your hands, a crude but vital fix that will hold for another muddy season. You set the tack aside on the wooden bench, standing up to stretch the stiffness from your shoulders and lower neck. The fire has burned down to a pile of glowing orange coals, radiating a dry, localized heat against your shins. You step away from the hearth, feeling the temperature drop immediately as you move toward the rear of the house. The division between warmth and freezing cold inside these homes was often a matter of just a few paces. A low wooden door connects your living space to the animal enclosure, its oak planks warped from years of absorbing interior moisture. You push it open, stepping into a narrow space that smells intensely of damp hay-old manure and the rich, oily scent of sheep's wool. 3 ewes turn their heads at the sound of the iron hinges, their breath rising in thick white plumes against the gloomy background. The air in the byre is distinctly warmer than the rest of the house, heated by the collective bodies of the livestock sharing your roof. You run your hand along the rough timber of the partition, feeling the deep grooves chewed by mice over the long winter. taking care of these animals is not just a daily chore, it is the very anchor of your existence in this harsh landscape. You grab a wooden pitchfork, leaning against the corner post-its tines, polished to a smooth sheen from constant friction against the hay. You plunge the tool into a small mound of dried grass, lifting a generous bundle and scattering it evenly across the feeding trough. The dry rustle of the hay is instantly drowned out by the eager shuffling of hooves and the wet, heavy sounds of chewing. You reach out, letting your bare fingers sink directly into the thick fleece of the nearest ewe. The wool is coarse and coated heavily in lanolin, leaving a greasy, protective film on your cold skin that wards off the dampness. You check the wooden water trough, using the handle of your pitchfork to shatter the thin sheet of ice that has formed over the surface. A muffled shout carries from somewhere outside the walls, followed closely by the heavy thud of an axe burying itself into a stump. You pause your work in the byre, listening to the rhythmic chopping that signals another neighbour battling the endless need for firewood. The sound is muted by the thick thatch and timber of your roof arriving, as a dull, echoing pulse that matches the steady chewing of the sheep. You pick up a crude broom made of bound birch twigs, sweeping the scattered droppings toward a central pile to be used for fertilizer in the spring. The dust rises around your ankles, catching the faint slivers of daylight that penetrate the wattle and daub walls. In isolated communities like this, you learn the habits of your neighbors not by speaking to them, but by recognizing the unique sounds of their daily labor. You leave the warm confinement of the byre, pulling the heavy door shut behind you and ensuring the iron latch drops securely into place. The afternoon demands a trip to the communal millstone, a task that cannot be delayed if there is to be fresh flour for the coming week. You gather a small linen sack of dried grain from the storage chest, hoisting it onto your shoulder with a practiced, fluid swing. The sack is heavier than it looks, the hard kernels pressing uncomfortably through the woven fabric directly against your collarbone. You step back out into the dirt track, bracing yourself as the damp, stagnant chill of the valley reclaims your body. The wind has dropped, leaving the air heavy and thick with the smell of wood smoke and turning earth. Have you ever noticed how the cold seems to bite harder when the air is perfectly still? The path toward the stream is steep and treacherous, winding downward over exposed roots and stones made slick by the brief morning thaw. You walk carefully, planting your leather-soled shoes flat against the ground to avoid losing your footing on the muddy decline. Grey lichen clings to the north side of the scattered rocks, a pale, ghostly crust that flakes away beneath your heavy tread. Below you, the stream cuts violently through the center of the valley, its dark water rushing over the ice-rimmed boulders with immense force. The sound of the current grows louder with every downward step, a constant, roaring presence that drowns out the rustling of the bare branches. The landscape here dictates every movement, punishing any lack of attention with a twisted ankle or a freezing fall. You reach the small wooden structure built partially over the rushing water, its lower timbers black with rot and constant spray. The heavy water wheel turns agonizingly over the river, groaning under the immense weight of the current pushing against its wooden paddles. You push through the open doorway, entering a cramped space filled with a fine, suffocating dust that coats every surface in a pale white film. The miller, a man whose beard is heavily dusted in raw flour, nods to you without breaking his physical rhythm. He pulls a heavy wooden lever, the unseen gears grinding with a deafening screech that vibrates through the floorboards directly into your boots. The sheer mechanical power of the rushing stream shaking the small building is both terrifying and magnificent. You lower the sack of grain from your aching shoulder, setting it down heavily on a rough-hewn table near the massive grinding stones. The air inside is surprisingly warm, heated by the intense friction of the massive rocks turning constantly against one another in the center of the room. You untie the hemp cord binding the sack, rolling the linen edges down to reveal the hard, pale kernels of winter rye you harvested months ago. The miller scoops a handful, inspecting the quality with an experienced eye before tossing it into the wooden hopper suspended above the stones. The grain vanishes down the chute, followed immediately by the harsh, crunching roar of the kernels being pulverized into dust. The smell of crushed starch fills the small room, heavy, raw, and earthy. Dust motes dance furiously in the meager light struggling through the single square window cut into the eastern wall of the mill. You watch the fine flour spill from the edge of the lower stone into a waiting, wooden bin, an endless, pale cascade of survival. The noise makes any conversation impossible, so you simply stand and wait, watching the culmination of months of farming being ground down in minutes. The wooden floor trembles continuously beneath your feet, a vibrating rhythm that makes your tired legs feel strangely numb. The miller uses a flat wooden paddle to scrape the fresh flour away from the turning edge. His movements purely mechanical and precise. In the shadow of Rome's collapse, preserving this simple engineering was a matter of life and death for the village. You hold open an empty leather pouch as the miller scoops the freshly ground flour out of the collection bin with a carved wooden bowl. The pale powder spills into your bag, surprisingly warm to the touch from the immense friction of the grinding stones. You tie the pouch securely, making sure no precious dust can escape the thick seams during the long climb back up the hill. You hand the miller a small copper coin, an ancient worn piece of currency that has likely circulated through this valley for a century. He pockets the coin without looking at it, turning his attention immediately back to the hopper and the endless, deafening turning of the stones. You step out of the mill, the sudden absence of the grinding roar leaving a high, ringing echo in your ears. The climb back toward the village requires twice the effort, your boots slipping in the mud that has begun to freeze again in the fading afternoon. You lean forward against the incline, clutching the heavy sack of warm flour to your chest to keep your center of gravity low and stable. The muscles in your thighs burn with the sustained exertion, demanding more oxygen than the freezing air seems willing to provide. You pause near a large, lightning-scarred oak tree, leaning your back against the rough bark to catch your breath. The valley stretches out below you, a patchwork of brown fields, dark forest lines, and the twisting black ribbon of the stream. The sheer scale of the landscape makes the small cluster of human dwellings look fragile and temporary. What must it have felt like to know the nearest town was a week's walk through hostile territory? You resume your march, the temperature noticeably dropping as the invisible sun begins its early descent behind the western ridge. The mud in the path has started to stiffen significantly, the edges of the shallow puddles forming delicate, jagged crystals of fresh ice. You spot a neighbor's child carrying a bundle of kindling almost as large as his own body, his face hidden beneath a heavy wool hood. He trundles past you without a word, his small boots making a soft crunching sound on the refreezing earth. You shift the sack of flour to your other arm, feeling the residual heat from the mill finally fade into the surrounding cold. The transition from afternoon to dusk happens quickly in the valley, the shadows lengthening abruptly as the light begins to fail. The village square is mostly empty as you reach the top of the incline, the inhabitants retreating to their hearths as the bitter cold intensifies. A lone dog scratches at the hardened dirt near the central well, its ribs showing clearly against its thin, coarse coat. Smoke now pours steadily from every roof hole, creating a thick, hazy canopy over the settlement that smells of pine sap and quiet desperation. The blacksmith's hammer has stopped ringing for the day, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence that presses firmly against your eardrums. You can hear the distant, hollow sound of a wooden bucket hitting the bottom of an empty trough. Does the approaching darkness bring relief from labor, or just a different kind of endurance? You pull a heavy iron axe from beneath the table upon entering your home, its edge dulled and chipped from weeks of splitting frozen pine. You retrieve a grey whetstone from a leather pouch, spitting onto the abrasive surface to provide crude lubrication for the steel. You draw the stone along the curved blade in long, sweeping motions, the harsh rasping sound filling the otherwise quiet room. The rhythmic scraping becomes a kind of meditation, requiring just enough focus to keep your mind from dwelling on the cold seeping through the walls. Tiny flecks of metal and stone gather along the edge, a dark metallic slurry that you wipe away with your raw thumb. You test the newly honed edge against your thumbnail, feeling the sharp bite of the refreshed steel catching the nail. A well-maintained tool was often the only difference between surviving the winter and freezing before the spring thaw. You set the sharpened axe near the doorway, your legs heavy and aching from the continuous labor and the steep climb from the river. You step toward the stone hearth, grabbing a handful of dry moss and the few thin twigs from the woven basket resting on the floor. You kneel on the packed earth, blowing gently into the banked coals until a bright orange crack spreads across the grey ash. The moss catches instantly, a sudden bright flare that pushes the deep shadows back into the far corners of the room. You feed larger pieces of split pine onto the growing flame, listening to the sharp hiss of trapped sap boiling out of the wood. The heat builds quickly, radiating against your face and chasing the damp chill from your heavy wool cloak. You stand up, your knees popping loudly in the quiet space, and turn your attention back to the sturdy wooden table. You untie the sack of freshly milled flour, reaching inside to pull out a small wooden cup full of the pale dust. You dump it into a clay bowl, adding a pinch of coarse grey salt scraped from a hardened block kept near the hearth. You pour a splash of cold water from the wooden bucket, using your bare fingers to mix the sticky, heavy dough. The paste clings stubbornly to your skin, a messy but strangely satisfying texture that promises a hot meal before the night sets in. You knead it against the edge of the bowl, feeling the resistance of the dough change as the water absorbs into the grain. A sharp gust of wind slams against the wooden shutters, forcing a thin spray of fine snow through the invisible cracks in the timber. You glance toward the window, watching the tiny white flakes melt instantly as they hit the floorboards near the radiating fire. The weather is turning again, the heavy grey clouds finally releasing the snow they have threatened to drop all day. You can hear the faint, dry rustle of the flakes accumulating against the thatch roof, a sound like 1,000 tiny claws scratching the dried reeds. The temperature in the room drops noticeably near the outer walls, forcing you to pull your stool closer to the hearth. The changing weather was a constant tyrant, dictating every action and movement within the valley without mercy. You flatten the ball of dough into a thick, uneven disc, rubbing your hands together to shake off the clinging remnants of flour. You place an iron griddle directly over the hottest section of the fire, waiting until a stray drop of water sizzles and vanishes upon contact. You drop the flatbread onto the hot metal, listening to the immediate hiss as the bottom begins to sear against the iron. The smell of baking bread fills the small room, a rich, comforting aroma that easily overpowers the scent of smoke and wet wool. You watch the edges of the dough begin to bubble and crisp, turning a deep golden brown in the flickering firelight. You flick the bread with your knife, the iron blade clinking sharply against the heavy griddle. You sit back on the stool, letting the warmth of the fire and the smell of the cooking food wash over you in a quiet wave. The physical toll of the day settles deeply into your bones, a heavy, dull ache that stretches from your calves all the way to your neck. You look at the worn tools hanging on the wall, the patched leather harness, the sturdy pitchfork, the mud-caked boots resting near the door. Every object in this room represents an hour of intense labor, a battle fought against the elements and the unforgiving earth. You tear a piece of the hot bread, tossing it between your hands to cool it before taking a careful bite. The late afternoon stretches out around you, hovering on the very edge of evening silent and resolute. The heat of the iron griddle fades as you swallow the last tough bite of the flatbread, leaving a faint, starchy coating on your tongue. The room feels a fraction smaller as the grey daylight retreats from the narrow walls, slits replaced by the chaotic swirling of thick white flakes. You stand from the low stool, the familiar ache in your lower back pulling tight like a heavy, overdrawn bowstring. The fire needs much more substantial fuel if it is to survive the plunging temperatures of the coming winter night. You wrap the heavy wool cloak back around your shoulders, instantly missing the direct, biting, radiant heat of the hearth. The iron latch of the external door is already rimed with a fresh layer of frost, stinging your bare fingers as you lift it. Wind immediately forces the heavy oak panel back against your chest, carrying a blast of icy powder that coats your hair and eyelashes. You push through the threshold, securing the door behind you with a solid, desperate shove to keep the precious warmth trapped inside the house. The village has transformed entirely in the short time you are indoors, the muddy ruts and scattered stones now buried under a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. Deep blue shadows stretch outward from the bases of the neighboring structures, merging into a continuous pool of heavy twilight. The air is remarkably crisp, stripping away the earlier smells of damp earth and replacing them with a sterile, metallic cold that burns your lungs. What would you have done if the snow had trapped you away from the safety of these walls? You trudged toward the rear of the dwelling, each step producing a distinct, dry crunch as your leather boots compress the newly fallen snow. The main woodpile sits stacked against the northern wall, protected by a stiff, frozen sheet of treated animal hide that crackles loudly as you pull it back. You grab a massive quarter split of seasoned oak, feeling the coarse, ridged bark scrape aggressively against the callous skin of your palms. The wood is remarkably dense and heavy, holding the vital promise of hours of sustained heat within its tightly bound rings. You stack 3 more logs across your left forearm, the combined weight forcing you to lean backward to maintain your balance on the slippery ground. Survival in places like this was never about comfort-only endurance. The gale howls down from the forested ridge, biting through the woven fibers of your cloak and finding the damp sweat still clinging to your under-tunic. You turn back toward the doorway, moving with a careful, deliberate gait, prevent a disastrous fall on the concealed ice beneath the snow. A lone figure hurries across the distant village square, completely obscured by a heavy grey mantle, looking like a phantom drifting through the storm. You reach the thick door and kick the bottom edge with your boot, jarring it loose from the ice that has already begun to seal the frame. You step inside, the sudden absence of the roaring wind hitting your ears with a strange, ringing pressure. You dump the frozen logs onto the packed earth beside the hearth with a resounding, heavy clatter that shakes the floorboards. Snow clings stubbornly to the rough wool of your shoulders, beginning to melt and soak through to your skin as you near the glowing fire. You shake the cloak out violently, sending a spray of water droplets sizzling violently into the orange coals of the hearth. You arrange the heavy oak logs over the existing embers, positioning them carefully to allow the drafted air to feed the underlying flames. The bark catches first, emitting a thick, fragrant smoke that briefly stings your eyes before escaping vertically through the roof hole. The room takes on a golden, flickering glow, the dancing light pushing the creeping shadows back into the far corners of the timber walls. Have you ever noticed how the smallest source of light feels like a fortress when the world outside turns hostile? You move toward a small, heavy wooden trapdoor set flush into the floorboards near the rear partition of the house. You grip the recessed iron ring, hauling the thick oak lid upward with a sharp grunt of effort, revealing the dark, square maw of the root cellar. A wave of stagnant, freezing air rises from the pit, carrying the heavy, earthy scent of aging turnips, damp soil, and dry straw. You carefully descend the short wooden ladder, your boots echoing dully in the cramped subterranean chamber carved directly into the valley floor. The darkness down here is absolute, requiring you to navigate entirely by touch and the ingrained memory of your own careful organization. Your hands brush against the rough exterior of a wicker basket, your fingers identifying the hard, spherical shapes of winter cabbages stored within. You move to the adjacent bin, feeling the shriveled, cold skins of last year's apples, carefully isolating and discarding one that has begun to turn soft and rot. Every piece of food down here represents hours of agonizing labor in the autumn summer, finite currency that must be spent with extreme calculation. You gather a handful of small, hard carrots and a single dense turnip, placing them into a fold of your tunic for the evening meal. You climb back up the ladder. the meager firelight of the main room feeling blindingly bright after the pitch black of the cellar. Poverty here was not temporary, it was a system. You let the heavy trapdoor fall shut with a solid, definitive thud, sealing the remaining provisions away from the encroaching frost above. You bring the root vegetables to the wooden table, using your small iron knife to scrape away the clinging clumps of dark cellar dirt. The blade makes a harsh, rhythmic rasping sound against the fibrous skin of the turnip, peeling away the tough exterior to reveal the pale flesh beneath. You chop the vegetable into uneven chunks, the satisfying resistance of the dense root sending a slight shock up the handle of the knife. You toss the pieces into a small iron pot along with the carrots, adding a ladle of water from the bucket to prepare a simple, sustaining broth. A deep, resonant note cuts through the howling wind outside, the sound of the bronze bell ringing from the small stone chapel at the edge of the settlement. The tolling marks the official arrival of dusk, a clear signal for all labourers to abandon the fields and secure their homesteads against the approaching night. You pause your chopping, listening to the heavy vibrations carry across the valley, a shared rhythm that binds the scattered villagers together in the darkness. The sound is both mournful and comforting, a stark reminder that you are not entirely isolated in this frozen wilderness. You push the iron pot over the flames, watching the water slowly begin to draw heat from the burning oak logs. The transition to evening means the end of outdoor labor, but survival demands that your hands remain occupied while the light still holds. You reach into a deep wooden bucket filled with cold water, pulling out a handful of thin, pliable willow branches you harvested a week ago. The wood is wet and flexible, smelling sharply of the riverbank and the bitter tannins of the soaked bark. You sit heavily on the stool, resting a half-finished wicker basket between your knees, the sturdy base already woven tightly together. You interlace a new branch through the vertical stakes, pulling the wet wood with a firm, practiced tension to ensure the walls remain rigid. Water drips from the soaked branches onto your woolen trousers, adding a localized patch of freezing dampness to your tired legs. You bend the willow sharply around the corner stake, feeling the fibers strain and stretch without snapping under the pressure of your thumbs. The repetitive motion of under and over becomes a hypnotic rhythm, requiring minimal thought and allowing your exhausted mind to drift. You listen to the pot beginning to simmer over the fire, a low, bubbling sound that promises warmth from the inside out. The smell of the cooking root vegetables mixes with the wet wood and the burning oak, creating a complex, heavy atmosphere in the small room. Can you imagine finding comfort in such endless, repetitive tasks? You finish the row of weaving, tying off the end of the branch with a tight, secure knot that buries the sharp edge inside the basket wall. You set the wickerwork aside, the wet wood gleaming in the firelight, and pick up a broken wooden rake head that needs immediate attention. You use the edge of your knife to carve a new wooden peg from a scrap of seasoned ash, shaping the cylinder with precise, deliberate strokes. Shavings of pale wood fall to the dirt floor, curling like tiny ribbons around the toes of your heavy leather boots. You test the fit of the peg in the broken joint, finding it slightly too thick, and resume carving with a steady, patient hand. The temperature outside plunges rapidly as the last bruised colors of dusk vanish entirely from the obscured sky, leaving the valley in total darkness. You can hear the wind battering the thick thatch of the roof, the dried reeds hissing and scraping together like a massive, agitated beast. A draft forces its way through a tiny gap between the wall logs, a concentrated needle of freezing air that strikes the back of your neck. You shift your stool closer to the hearth, seeking the radiant heat of the oak logs that are now fully engulfed in bright, leaping flames. The contrast between the roaring fire and the encroaching cold creates a tense, fragile boundary within the walls of your home. In winters like this, even a small fire could decide how the night would pass. You stand from the stool, brushing the pale wood shavings from your lap, and move toward the partition door to perform the final check on the livestock. You push the heavy timber open, greeted instantly by the warm, thick stench of manure and the damp, oily smell of tightly packed wool. The sheep are huddled close together in the far corner of the byre, their heads lowered, conserving their collective body heat against the freezing draught. You reach into the feed trough, ensuring they have enough dry hay to last until the morning light returns to the valley. You run your bare hand over the thick fleece of the nearest ewe, feeling the steady, reassuring thrum of her heartbeat beneath the coarse wool. You pull the partition door shut, dropping the heavy iron bar into its slot to ensure no opportunistic predators can breach the inner walls. You walk toward the single window, lifting the solid wooden shutter and pressing it firmly against the frame to block the violent wind. You slide a thick wooden peg through the iron latch, locking the barrier in place and sealing the house completely from the outside world. The room instantly becomes darker and much quieter, the roaring of the storm reduced to a muffled, continuous vibration through the solid timbers. The isolation of the dwelling is now absolute, a tiny, fragile wooden box standing defiant against the massive, freezing expanse of the wilderness. You return to the hearth, taking a carved wooden spoon to stir the simmering broth that now fills the room with a rich, earthy steam. The thick turnips and carrots have softened, releasing their meager starches into the water to create a thin but fiercely hot stew. You use a folded scrap of thick wool to protect your hand as you lift the iron pot away from the direct flame, setting it gently on the warm stones. You pour the liquid into your wooden bowl, the heat radiating through the carved wood and warming your stiff, raw fingers almost instantly. You sit back on the stool, holding the bowl close to your chest, letting the heavy steam rise and thaw the cold from your face. You take the first careful sip of the broth, the scalding liquid burning a welcome path down your throat and settling heavily in your empty stomach. The flavor is blunt and simple, lacking any spice or rich fat, but the sheer heat of it feels like a profound victory over the weather. You chew the softened chunks of root vegetable slowly, extracting every possible bit of sustenance from the rough, fibrous harvest. The fire pops loudly, spitting a tiny glowing ember onto the packed earth floor where it quickly fades into a dark, lifeless cinder. The day's labor is finally over, leaving only the slow, quiet process of waiting out the long hours of the frozen evening. You scrape the bottom of the wooden bowl with your spoon, gathering the final lingering drops of the hot broth. The carved wood feels warm and slightly damp against your calloused palms, a temporary comfort that will fade the moment you set it aside. A sudden gust of wind slams into the eastern wall of the house, shaking the heavy timber frame and rattling the iron latch on the door. You listen to the dried thatch rustle violently overhead, sounding like a frantic flock of unseen birds trapped against the roof. The fire spits a sudden shower of orange sparks into the air, illuminating the swirling dust motes before plunging the corners back into deep shadow. You lean forward to push a charred log deeper into the coals, the coarse bark crumbling instantly under the iron poker. Heat radiates intensely against your shins, baking the wet mud that still clings stubbornly to the lower cuffs of your wool trousers. You pick up the empty bowl and set it onto the narrow table, the hollow thud swallowed quickly by the howling gale outside. Your fingers trace the deep, familiar grain of the table's surface, feeling the historical map of knife marks and burn scars left by previous generations. A single drop of freezing water falls from a gap in the roof, striking the packed earth floor with a sharp, isolated hiss. The cold is a constant physical presence pressing against the outer walls, searching endlessly for a way to infiltrate your small sanctuary. At this time, most homes had no insulation at all, and the cold never truly left the walls. You reach for a heavy woven sack resting near the foot of your narrow bed, pulling out a bundle of untreated sheep's fleece. The raw wool smells strongly of lanolin and damp animal, a heavy, pungent odor that immediately dominates the small space. You pull a pair of iron carding combs from a wooden peg, their sharp metal teeth gleaming dully in the erratic firelight. Dragging the combs against each other requires a surprising amount of upper body strength, the tangled fibers resisting the metal before tearing apart with a harsh, ripping sound. You watch the dirty, matted clumps slowly align into smooth, pale sheets, ready to be spun into desperately needed thread. The physical effort sends a fresh wave of tired aches through your upper back, a reminder of the day's brutal labor. Fine, pale fibers float upward from the combs, caught in the thermal updraft of the hearth and vanishing into the chimney hole. You pause the heavy rhythm to wipe a sheen of sweat from your brow, feeling the coarse grit of dirt still trapped in the creases of your skin. The wind outside shifts its pitch, rising to a high, sustained shriek that easily cuts through the solid oak door. You stare at the glowing embers, watching a thin vein of blue flame dance erratically along the edge of a burning oak knot. The isolation of the long evening stretches out before you, an unbroken expanse of darkness broken only by the steady drag of the iron teeth. What would you have done to keep your mind occupied during these endless frozen nights? The pile of carded wool grows steadily beside your stool, a soft, pale mound that catches the golden light of the fire. You set the heavy iron tools down on the floorboards, flexing your cramped fingers and listening to the joints pop loudly in the quiet room. A heavy, persistent ache settles into the base of your neck, a physical consequence of hunching over the tedious work for the past hour. You stand slowly, bracing your hand against the rough timber wall to steady yourself as a brief wave of dizziness washes over you. Your heavy leather boots feel like lead weights anchored to your calves as you step toward the small shuttered window. You press your palm flat against the thick oak shutter, feeling the aggressive seeping cold radiating directly through the solid wood. A thin layer of frost has already begun to form on the iron hinges, pale and crystalline against the dark, hammered metal. You push a scrap of loose wool into a small crack between the frame and the wall, attempting to block a persistent needle of freezing air. The draft instantly chills the sweat on your neck, sending a violent shiver down your spine that rattles your teeth. You pull your thick cloak tighter across your chest, securing the bone toggle at the throat to trap whatever body heat remains. Survival in places like this was never about comfort, only endurance. Moving away from the freezing exterior wall, you step back into the localized halo of warmth generated by the hearth. You bend down to retrieve your work boots, untying the stiff leather laces and pulling them from your aching, damp feet. The woolen socks beneath are heavily soaked with sweat and melted snow, sticking uncomfortably to your chilled skin. You peel them off, draping the damp fabric over a wooden drying rack positioned carefully near the edge of the fire. The smell of wet wool immediately intensifies, a thick, sour aroma that mixes with the wood smoke and the lingering scent of boiled root vegetables. You rub your bare feet with calloused hands, trying to force the sluggish blood to circulate through your numb toes. A pair of dry, reserve socks waits in a wooden chest at the foot of your bed, woven from much thicker, darker yarn. You pull them on, savoring the immediate, abrasive warmth of the dry wool against your cold skin. You pick up one of the wet leather boots, inspecting the worn sole near the heel where the heavy stitching has begun to fray. The damp leather is stubbornly stiff, fighting against your grip as you bend it back to examine the extent of the damage. You pull a thick bone needle and a length of waxed linen thread from a small leather pouch hanging on your belt. Repairing footwear is a constant battle against the mud and ice, a chore that simply cannot be ignored if you intend to walk tomorrow. Pushing the thick needle through the hardened leather requires you to press the dull end against a flat stone to force it through the layers. The thread pulls tight with a satisfying high-pitched squeak, binding the fraying sole back to the upper casing of the boot. You repeat the process, establishing a tight, rhythmic cadence that eats away at the slow passage of the evening hours. A sudden pop from the hearth sends a shower of white ash raining down onto the hearthstone, brief and silent like a miniature snowfall. You wipe the ash away with the side of your boot, not missing a stitch as your hands work automatically in the dim light. Have you ever noticed how the hands seem to remember a task even when the mind is utterly exhausted? The storm outside shows no signs of breaking, the wind continuing to batter the small house with relentless, terrifying force. You finish the final knot on the boot, snapping the waxed thread with your teeth and tasting the bitter beeswax on your tongue. Setting the repaired footwear near the drying rack, you sit back on the low stool and stare blankly into the dying flames. The heat of the fire has baked the front of your woolen trousers, making the heavy fabric stiff and uncomfortably hot against your thighs. You shift your weight, seeking a balance between the scalding proximity of the hearth and the freezing draft circling your back. The room feels dangerously small, a tiny pocket of light and heat suspended in a vast ocean of freezing darkness. You rise to perform the final checks of the night, your bare feet padding softly across the uneven, packed earth floor. You lift a heavy clay pitcher, pouring a meager splash of water over a smouldering lob to control the burn rate for the long hours ahead. The water hits the wood with an angry, sharp hiss, sending a thick cloud of white steam billowing up into the chimney hole. You use the iron poker to push the remaining unburnt wood closer together, banking the coals beneath a protective layer of pale grey ash. The light in the room dims significantly, dropping the corners into absolute blackness and leaving only a dull, pulsing red glow in the center. In communities like this, silence often meant the world was finally resting. The darkness amplifies the sounds of the storm, making the creaking timbers sound like a ship straining against a massive ocean swell. You walk toward the narrow bed frame, your hand trailing along the rough wall to guide you through the heavy gloom. The mattress is stuffed with dried bracken and straw, rustling loudly as you press your hand against the coarse linen cover. You pull back the heavy, layered wool blankets, feeling the icy surface of the sheets that have absorbed the ambient cold of the room. The prospect of leaving the hearth to lie in that freezing bed requires a specific kind of mental preparation. You stand at the edge of the mattress, delaying the inevitable shock of the cold sheets for just a moment longer. You reach back to unfasten your heavy outer tunic, letting the coarse, sweat-stained fabric fall to the floor with a soft thud. The chill of the room bites instantly through your thin linen undershirt, raising goosebumps along your arms and across your chest. You quickly fold the heavy wool cloak, placing it strategically over the foot of the bed to provide an extra layer of crucial insulation. You pick up a small, smooth riverstone that has been resting near the edge of the hearth for the past hour. The rock is fiercely hot, radiating a deep, penetrating warmth that burns slightly against your calloused palms. You wrap it quickly in a scrap of old fabric, creating a makeshift source of heat to push the worst of the cold from the center of the mattress. Can you imagine relying on a heated stone to survive the night? You slide the wrapped stone under the heavy blankets, pushing it down toward the foot of the bed where your toes will rest. The faint smell of scorching linen rises briefly before fading into the overwhelming scent of damp straw and old wool. You sit on the edge of the mattress, the wooden frame groaning in protest beneath your weight as you pull your legs up. The darkness of the room is almost complete now, the banked fire offering nothing more than a faint, dying ember of light. The wind outside delivers another crushing blow against the roof, rattling the heavy timber beams and shaking dust onto the floor. You pull the heavy blankets up to your chin, the rough wool scraping against your jawline. The initial shock of the cold bedding sends a sharp shiver through your entire frame, your muscles tensing involuntarily against the freezing fabric. You curl your body into a tight position, drawing your knees up toward your chest to conserve the fragile pocket of body heat. Your toes find the wrapped riverstone, the intense localized warmth providing a stark and desperate contrast to the freezing sheets. You listen to your own breathing, a ragged, uneven sound in the darkness that slowly begins to find a calmer, steadier rhythm. The heavy wool blankets press down on you like a physical weight, trapping you in a dark, restrictive cocoon of survival. In winters like this, even a small fire could decide how the night would pass. Above you, the thatch roof continues to rustle and shift, a constant reminder of the violent storm raging just inches from your face. You can hear the faint, muffled shifting of the sheep in the adjoining byre, a soft scraping of hooves against the wooden floorboards. Their presence offers a strange, grounding comfort, a reminder of the shared endurance required to outlast the brutal winter months. The smell of the smoke begins to fade, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the freezing air that slowly seeps into the room. You close your eyes briefly, the darkness behind your eyelids indistinguishable from the pitch black of the windowless house. The night stretches endlessly ahead, a frozen wasteland of time that must be crossed before the grey light of dawn returns. Your muscles throb with a dull, heavy ache, the accumulated fatigue of breaking the frozen earth and milling the grain finally demanding its toll. You shift slightly beneath the heavy wool, finding a hollow in the straw mattress that perfectly matches the curve of your spine. The rough linen sheet scratches against your shoulder blade, an annoying sensation that you force your exhausted mind to deliberately ignore. A tiny draft finds its way under the edge of the blanket, a localized spear of cold that strikes your bare collarbone. You reach out, pulling the heavy fabric tighter around your neck, burying your face halfway into the coarse wool. The fight against the elements continues even in the dark. You open your eyes again, staring up at the invisible ceiling, tracking the faint sounds of the settling timber frame. A mouse scurries rapidly across the floorboards near the hearth, its tiny claws clicking sharply against the hard, packed earth. The sound is a sudden interruption in the heavy silence of the room, followed immediately by a return to the oppressive stillness. You wonder briefly if the snow has already buried the stone boundary walls of the fields you worked this morning. The valley outside is a hostile, alien landscape now, surrendered entirely to the wind, the ice, and the suffocating darkness. Have you ever noticed how the most familiar places become alien and unrecognizable in the dead of night? The warmth from the riverstone slowly begins to spread upward, thawing the painful stiffness from your ankles and calves. You flex your toes against the wrapped fabric, savoring the feeling of the blood circulating freely through the previously numb extremities. The rest of the bed remains stubbornly cold, forcing you to remain locked in your tight, defensive posture beneath the heavy blankets. The wind howls a long, mournful note through the eaves, a sound that seems to vibrate directly into your aching bones. You breathe deeply, the freezing air burning your nostrils and tasting faintly of the dust that constantly falls from the thatch. You listen to the slow, heavy dripping of water from the melting snow near the chimney, a steady, hypnotic rhythm hitting the stones. The sound is sharp and precise, a single drop every few seconds that marks the agonizingly slow passage of the deep night hours. Your mind drifts to the heavy iron hoe resting near the door, a silent promise of the brutal labor that awaits when the sun finally rises. You clench your jaw, pushing the thought away, focusing entirely on the tiny, fragile warmth trapped within the heavy wool blankets. The darkness in the room presses against your open eyes, an absolute void that offers no distraction and no escape. The village sleeps under a frozen shroud, enduring the dark as it has for generations. The heavy oak door rattles again in its frame, the frozen iron hinges groaning under the immense pressure of the wind. You shift your head on the straw-stuffed pillow, the stiff, dry reeds crunching loudly right next to your ear. The smell of the decaying bracken inside the ticking rises around your face, a dusty, earthy scent that belongs to late autumn harvests. You run a callous thumb across the rough edge of the wool blanket, feeling the coarse, uneven weave of the homespun yarn. Your breath forms a faint, invisible cloud in the freezing air, dampening the upper edge of the sheet covering your mouth. Every movement in the dark requires effort, fighting against the heavy, restrictive weight of the piled bedding. The rhythmic dripping from the chimney slows as the temperature outside drops even further, the melting snow refreezing into solid ice. You listen to the sharp, sudden crack of a wooden beam contracting in the extreme cold, a sound echoing like a cracked whip in the valley. The noise hangs in the silent room for a long moment before the howling wind sweeps it away, leaving the space perfectly still once more. You pull your knees up a fraction higher, pressing your cold calves against the back of your thighs to maximize the retained heat. The river stone at your feet begins to lose its intense heat, settling into a dull, comforting warmth that barely fights back the encroaching chill. The deep night rules the valley now, unbroken and unyielding. You lie perfectly still beneath the heavy wool, listening to the violent rhythm of the wind tearing across the valley. The river stone at your feet has surrendered its remaining heat, leaving your toes to slowly numb against the coarse linen sheet. You pull the thick blankets up to your nose, tasting the dusty, stale scent of the dried bracken trapped within the mattress ticking. Every breath you take releases a pale, ghostly cloud that immediately dissipates into the freezing shadows above your face. The darkness in the room is absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that presses directly against your open eyes. The deep night offers no reprieve from the constant grinding awareness of the cold. Outside, the storm intensifies, throwing handfuls of hard, granular snow against the solid oak shutters with a sound like scattered gravel. The timber frame of the house groans in protest, a deep, structural complaining that vibrates down through the packed earth floor. Frost begins to creep across the interior surface of the iron door latch, a delicate, creeping web of white crystals visible only in the mind's eye. The temperature inside the small dwelling continues to plummet, stripping away the fragile boundary between the interior sanctuary and the hostile wilderness. This late hour belongs entirely to the elements, an unbroken expanse of freezing isolation that demands total endurance. You shift your weight on the narrow bed, the dried straw crunching loudly beneath your hips and breaking the tense silence of the room. A sharp needle of cold air slips past the collar of your tunic, biting directly into the sweat-dampened skin of your shoulder. You clench your jaw to keep your teeth from chattering, the sudden shivering pulling precious energy from your exhausted muscles. The banked fire across the room offers no radiant heat at this distance, forcing you to rely entirely on the accumulated layers of rough wool. You close your eyes, attempting to force your mind into a state of rest, but the physical discomfort remains too sharp to ignore. Have you ever noticed how the deepest part of the night makes every physical ache feel twice as pronounced? You throw the heavy blankets back, the sudden exposure to the freezing air striking your chest like a physical blow. You swing your legs over the edge of the wooden frame, your bare feet recoiling instantly as they touch the icy, packed earth floor. You grab your thick wool cloak from the foot of the bed, wrapping it tightly around your shoulders with numb, stiff fingers. The dark room feels vast and disorienting, the familiar landmarks of the table and stool swallowed entirely by the pitch black. You step carefully toward the hearth, keeping your hands extended to avoid colliding with the heavy wooden support beam in the center of the space. Faint red light pulses weakly from beneath a thick layer of grey ash, the only remaining sign of life in the cold dwelling. The smell of the dormant fire is sharp and acrid, a concentrated scent of charred oak and baked earth that stings the nostrils. A localized pocket of mild warmth hovers just inches above the stones, a desperate, fragile remnant of the evening's roaring blaze. The silence near the hearth is heavy, broken only by the microscopic, dry ticking of the cooling embers shifting in the pit. Even this tiny amount of light brings a strange, instinctive comfort to the primitive, waking mind. You kneel on the hardened mud, ignoring the sharp protest of your stiff joints, and reach for the heavy iron poker. You drag the metal hook carefully through the ash, uncovering the glowing, orange heart of the banked coals. The sudden influx of air causes the embers to flare, casting long, erratic shadows that dance wildly against the rough timber walls. You place a handful of dry moss directly onto the hot center, watching the thin, twisting ribbon of smoke rise toward the chimney hole. You blow softly into the ash, your breath catching the spark and pushing the moss into a sudden bright bloom of yellow flame. You feed 3 small, split pieces of dried pine into the newly born fire, listening to the instantaneous, sharp crackle of the wood catching. The rich, resinous scent of burning pine sap immediately overpowers the stale odor of the cold ash, filling the space with a heavy, sweet smoke. You hold your raw, trembling hands out toward the growing flames, the intense, localized heat biting painfully into your numb fingertips. You rub your palms together, feeling the calloused, cracked skin snag, and pull as the sluggish blood begins to circulate once more. The orange light reveals the familiar, chaotic texture of the mud-plastered walls, grounding you back in the reality of your own home. In places like this, fire was not just a tool for warmth, it was a companion that required constant, careful attention to survive. Worn tools hang silently from their wooden pegs along the eastern partition, their iron edges catching the flickering reflection of the hearth. The long handle of the hoe rests against the corner, still carrying a thick crust of frozen mutt from the morning's brutal labor. A leather harness hangs nearby, the stiff, greased straps smelling faintly of animal sweat and the bitter tallow used to waterproof the hide. These implements dictate the entire rhythm of existence in the valley, a silent, demanding audience that waits patiently for the return of the sun. The shadows stretch and shrink across the tools, giving them an eerie, almost lifelike quality in the isolated darkness. You pull the low wooden stool closer to the stones, the legs scraping harshly against the dirt as you sit down. You adjust the heavy cloak over your knees, creating a makeshift tent to trap the radiant heat rising from the burning pine. You look down at your hands, turning them over to inspect a deep, jagged scratch across your left palm acquired during the day's fieldwork. The wound is dark and crusted with dried blood, surrounded by a tight, angry rim of inflamed red skin that throbs in time with your pulse. You use your thumb to gently press the edges of the cut, testing the tenderness and assessing the risk of infection. You reach for a small clay jar sitting on the edge of the hearth, its exterior slick with years of accumulated grease. You pry the wooden stopper loose, releasing the pungent, medicinal aroma of crushed comfrey root mixed with rendered animal fat. You scoop a small amount of the dense salve with your index finger, the texture thick and gritty against your skin. You press the ointment directly into the open scratch, grinding your teeth together as a sharp, brilliant sting shoots up your forearm. You rub the excess grease around the wound, the thick fat creating a protective barrier against the pervasive dirt and dampness of the house. A minor injury in this isolated valley carried a heavy weight, an ever-present reminder of how fragile human endurance truly was. Muffled movement sounds from the adjoining byre, a slow, heavy rustling of dry straw as the sheep adjust their positions in the dark. A low, vibrating bleat penetrates the timber partition, a sound of mild discomfort that resonates in the quiet of the deep night. The smell of the livestock filters through the cracks, a dense, oily aroma that speaks of living bodies generating their own necessary heat. The animals are a vital, breathing investment, their survival inextricably linked to your own through the brutal, freezing months of winter. Their presence on the other side of the wall makes the severe isolation of the storm feel slightly less absolute. You wipe your greasy finger on the hem of your woolen trouser leg, leaving a dark, oily smear on the coarse fabric. You reach into a woven basket sitting near the table leg, pulling out a tangled length of thin, raw leather stripping. You separate 3 strands, tying the ends into a secure knot, and anchor the bundle beneath the heel of your heavy boot. You begin to braid the leather, your fingers moving in a tight, repetitive pattern that requires no visual focus in the dim light. The physical task provides a necessary anchor for your waking mind, a simple rhythm to push back against the endless expanse of the night. You pull the strands tight with every crossing, the leather emitting a faint, high-pitched squeak as the friction heats the raw hide. The cord grows steadily between your hands, a strong, durable line that will eventually be used to repair a broken snare or secure a loose shutter. You let the hypnotic motion soothe your racing thoughts, focusing entirely on the tactile sensation of the smooth, tough leather sliding over your knuckles. The fire pops loudly, sending a small, glowing cinder arcing through the air to land harmlessly on the packed earth near your foot. You do not break your rhythm, your hands working with a stubborn, blind efficiency born of endless repetition. Wind continues to batter the exterior of the dwelling, the sheer force of the gale finding new, microscopic gaps in the daub and wattle walls. A fine dusting of powdery snow blows directly through a crack near the ceiling, drifting down through the dark air like pale glowing ash. The flakes land on the wooden table and instantly freeze, creating tiny crystalline monuments to the bitter temperature residing just outside the hearth's reach. The heavy oak door shudders in its frame, the iron hinges groaning under a sudden, massive shift in the air pressure outside. The valley remains entirely surrendered to the storm, a hostile, frozen landscape that tolerates no weakness. Can you imagine the profound sense of vulnerability that comes with knowing a single wooden door is your only shield against the winter? You finish the length of the leather braid, tying off the loose ends with a tight, complex knot that buries the raw edges inward. You lift your boot, freeing the anchored end, and coil the finished cord neatly before dropping it into a leather pouch at your belt. You rub your tired eyes with the heel of your hand, feeling the grit of wood smoke and exhaustion scratching against your corneas. The short burst of pine has burned down to a fragile lattice of glowing orange coals, the heat already beginning to wane in the freezing room. You realize you cannot stay by the fire indefinitely. The cold bed waiting in the shadows must eventually be faced again. You stand slowly, your joints stiffening almost immediately as you step away from the direct, radiant warmth of the hearthstones. You walk over to the wooden water bucket, picking up the heavy iron ladle resting on the roughly carved lid. You break the thin layer of ice that has already reformed over the surface, the sharp cracking sound echoing loudly in the quiet space. You dip the ladle into the freezing water, lifting it to your lips and taking a slow, careful swallow. The liquid hits your stomach like a swallowed stone, a shocking, metallic cold that violently awakens your tired senses. A long, wavering howl rises above the chaotic noise of the wind, distant but piercingly clear across the frozen expanse of the valley. The sound is high and desolate, a pure expression of wild hunger that sends a sudden primal spike of adrenaline rushing into the bloodstream. It hangs in the air for several seconds, dropping in pitch before being swallowed entirely by the roaring gale tearing through the pines. The silence inside the house feels suddenly heavy and fragile, the wooden walls seeming painfully thin against the reality of the forest outside. The wilderness is awake, hunting in the deep hours while the human world hides behind locked doors and dying fires. You freeze with the iron ladle still halfway to your mouth, your breath catching in your throat as you listen for a second call. You grip the cold metal handle so tightly that your knuckles turn white, your eyes straining uselessly against the impenetrable darkness of the room. The absolute stillness of your own body contrasts sharply with the violent, shifting noises of the storm hammering against the roof. You wait, counting the heavy thumps of your own heartbeat, until you are certain the solitary wolf has moved further down the ridge. You lower the ladle back into the bucket, the small splash sounding unnaturally loud to your hyper-aware ears. Survival in this era meant learning to decipher the noises of the night, separating the sounds of the weather from the sounds of the hunt. You wipe the freezing water from your chin with the back of your hand, the rough wool of your sleeve scratching across your jaw. You turn back toward the hearth, picking up the iron poker to arrange the remaining coals into a tight, concentrated mound in the center. You shovel a thick layer of grey ash over the glowing embers, starving them of air to ensure they survive until the morning light. The room plunges back into heavy, oppressive darkness, the brief illusion of comfort banished instantly by the returning chill. You pull your thick cloak tighter, tracing your steps back across the dark, uneven floor toward the waiting bed. You reach the edge of the mattress, running your hand over the coarse linen sheets to find the opening in the heavy layers of wool. The residual heat from your previous attempt at rest has completely vanished, leaving the bedding feeling like a solid block of woven ice. You sit on the edge, quickly kicking off your leather boots and swinging your legs up onto the rustling, dry straw ticking. You pull the heavy blankets up to your chin, curling into a tight, defensive knot to minimize your exposure to the freezing air. The deep night closes in around you once more, an unbroken, silent test of endurance that must be endured until the dawn. Shadows dominate every corner of the dwelling, stretching out from the dying hearth like long, dark fingers reaching across the packed earth. The scent of the comfrey salve lingers in the stagnant air, a sharp, medicinal note that cuts through the heavier smells of smoke and sheep. The wind outside shifts direction slightly, battering the northern wall with a renewed ferocity that shakes the wooden pegs holding the tools. A thick layer of snow continues to accumulate on the thatch roof, adding a massive, crushing weight to the ancient, groaning timber beams. The valley is locked in the grip of the storm, a frozen, static world where time seems to stretch and distort in the darkness. You listen to the slow, agonizing sound of a wooden ceiling joist contracting in the extreme cold, a sharp cracking noise that echoes like a gunshot. You squeeze your eyes shut, trying to force your mind away from the physical reality of the freezing room and the exhaustion in your bones. You focus on the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the sheep through the partition, using the sound as a steady, living metronome to anchor your thoughts. The scratch on your hand pulses with a dull, low ache, the thick grease doing little to ease the deep, bruising pain of the torn skin. You lie in the dark, a tiny, fragile spark of warmth suspended in an ocean of winter. You pull the edge of the wool blanket over your head, creating a small enclosed pocket of air that slowly begins to warm from your breath. The coarse fibers tickle your nose, smelling heavily of dirt, old sweat, and the bitter lanolin that keeps the fabric resistant to the damp. You feel the heavy, oppressive weight of the accumulated hours pressing down on you, the deep night demanding a toll for every minute spent awake. You try to picture the layout of the fields you worked earlier, tracing the invisible lines of the frozen furrows in your mind's eye. The mental exercise is a desperate attempt to fend off the creeping dread of the isolation and the relentless biting cold. Across towns like this, the deep night was a communal experience of silent endurance, lived entirely in the dark. You keep your body perfectly still, knowing that any shifting will only let the freezing drafts penetrate your carefully constructed cocoon of wool. The river stone at your feet is completely cold now, just another hard, lifeless object resting against your numb toes in the dark. You listen to the wind, realizing that the chaotic howling has finally begun to settle into a lower, more constant drone against the ridge. The worst of the squall seems to be passing, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating stillness that feels even more isolating than the violent storm. You remain awake, trapped in the long, dark corridor between the dead of night and the distant, fragile hope of the coming morning. The violent howling that battered the timber walls for hours has finally bled away into a vast, hollow silence. You push the heavy wool blanket down just far enough to expose your eyes to the oppressive darkness of the room. A fine grit of dust, shaken loose from the thatch by the gale, coats the tip of your nose and tastes faintly of dried clay. The sudden absence of the wind leaves a ringing sensation in your ears, a phantom echo of the storm's fading fury. The air inside the dwelling is utterly stagnant now, trapping the freezing temperature in a heavy, motionless pool around the bed frame. You blink against the pitch black, your mind searching for any sound to anchor itself against the overwhelming isolation. You slide your right arm out from beneath the covers, the freezing air immediately seizing the sweat-dampened linen of your undershirt. Your fingers grope blindly along the rough wooden edge of the mattress frame, searching for a bundle of thick rags you keep nearby. The wood is splintered and icy to the touch, carrying the ambient cold of the packed earth floor directly into your skin. You locate the twisted fabric, a collection of old tunics deemed too ragged to wear, but too valuable to discard. The material is stiff, smelling faintly of the root cellar and old wood smoke, offering a meagre defense against the elements. A sharp, localized draft continues to knife its way through the wall logs right beside your shoulder, demanding immediate attention. Have you ever noticed how the smallest drop in temperature can wake the body from the deepest exhaustion? Stuffing the coarse rags into the unseen gap requires a strange, blind precision that your calloused hands have mastered over countless winters. The rough fibers scrape against the hardened mud daub, filling the negative space between the massive oak logs with a dense barrier. The freezing needle of air instantly vanishes, leaving a localized patch of numb skin on your collarbone that slowly begins to throb. The house complains around you, the frozen timbers contracting further with loud sudden snaps that mimic the sound of breaking bone. These structural groans are the only proof that the world outside the wooden walls has not ceased to exist entirely. You pull your arm back under the heavy blankets, tucking your freezing fingers firmly into your armpits to force the blood back into the digits. The deep night stretches out, a seemingly infinite expanse of time where the sun feels like nothing more than a forgotten myth. You listen to the measured, rhythmic breathing of the sheep through the partition, the sound muffled by the thick timber but undeniably present. Their collective warmth is a crucial asset, a living engine of heat that slightly raises the temperature of the adjoining wall. You press your shoulder against the wooden planks, seeking even the faintest transfer of thermal energy from the animals on the other side. The rough grain of the wood bites into your skin through the thin linen, a grounding sensation in the disorienting dark. Ice crystals have undoubtedly formed thick across the interior of the single window shutter, locking the heavy iron latch in a frozen grip. The banked hearth across the room emits no light whatsoever, the grey ash suffocating the remaining coals to preserve them for the morning. A faint smell of scorched comfrey salve still clings to your left hand, mingling with the earthy stench of the dried bracken mattress. The raw, throbbing pain of the scratch on your palm has dulled to a persistent ache, a minor casualty in the daily war against the landscape. Every breath creates a stark white plume in the air, invisible to the eye but heavy and damp against the upper edge of the blanket. You shift your legs cautiously, careful not to disturb the fragile pocket of trapped body heat you have managed to build over the last hour. The river stone, wrapped in cloth near your feet, is now nothing more than a cold, hard lump, offering no comfort against your stiff ankles. You stretch your calves, feeling a sudden, vicious cramp seize the muscle in your right leg with agonizing force. You bite down hard on your lower lip to stifle a groan, grabbing the knotted muscle through the thick wool and kneading it fiercely. The pain blossoms hot and sharp, a stark contrast to the numbing cold that grips the rest of your exhausted frame. You massage the hardened flesh until the spasm finally releases, leaving behind a deep, trembling weakness in the limb. In winters like this, the body was treated like a working tool, requiring constant maintenance just to function the next day. Above the narrow bed, the thatched roof holds the accumulated weight of the night's snowfall in a precarious, heavy balance. The dried reeds occasionally slip against the bindings, a dry, rustling whisper that filters down through the freezing, stagnant air. The massive central support beam of the house, cut from a single ancient oak, stands resolute against the crushing pressure. You know the exact texture of its bark, the deep fissures and knots mapped out in your memory from years of staring up into the gloom. The architecture of survival in this valley relies on the strength of the wood and the stubbornness of the hands that shaped it. You trace the rough hem of the blanket with your thumb, feeling the uneven tension of the homespun yarn beneath your calloused skin. The repetitive motion offers a small anchor for your wandering mind, a tactile distraction from the pervasive chill seeping into the mattress. You try to calculate the remaining provisions in the root cellar, visualizing the shrinking pile of wrinkled apples and dense, dirt-caked turnips. The mathematics of winter are brutal and unforgiving, requiring strict discipline to ensure the food lasts until the spring thaw breaks the soil. You swallow dryly, a sudden phantom hunger gnawing at your empty stomach despite the hot broth consumed hours earlier. The body constantly demands fuel in the cold, a relentless furnace that is never truly satisfied. Shadows seem to carry their own physical weight in this deepest part of the night, pressing down on the chest and restricting the lungs. A distant, muffled crack echoes from the forest edge, the sound of a massive, frozen tree branch finally snapping under the burden of the snow. The noise travels clearly through the crisp, dead air, a sharp reminder of the lethal conditions waiting just beyond the threshold of the door. The isolation is complete, severing the village from whatever broader civilization still clings to existence in the southern lands. History here is not recorded in books or monuments, but in the calloused hands and scarred tools of the people who refuse to yield. What must it have felt like to know your survival depended entirely on the strength of a few iron tools? You open your eyes wide, staring upward into the suffocating blackness, challenging the void that surrounds the narrow bed. The darkness plays tricks on the exhausted mind, creating phantom shapes and subtle movements where there is only still, freezing air. You close your eyes again tightly, deciding that the blindness behind your own eyelids is preferable to the empty expanse of the room. A stray thought drifts toward the iron-tipped hoe leaning against the far wall, the implement waiting silently for the dawn to command your labor once more. You force the impending reality of the morning away, knowing that dwelling on the coming toil will only steal whatever brief rest the night might offer. You focus solely on the slow, measured rhythm of your own breathing. Somewhere deep beneath the packed earth floor, the subterranean frost line continues its relentless advance toward the foundation stones. The cold radiating from the ground is a pervasive, heavy entity, sapping the thermal energy from the very structure of the dwelling. The wooden stool near the hearth creaks faintly as the temperature forces the joints to contract, a tiny domestic sound in the vast silence. It is a world suspended in a frozen stasis, a long, dark holding pattern where life simply waits for the earth to tilt back toward the sun. The only defense is stillness, wrapping tight in the woven wool and outlasting the brutal rotation of the night. You untangle your legs slightly, finding a new, marginally less painful position on the rustling straw of the mattress. The stiff linen sheet grabs at your woolen socks, the friction creating a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of static electricity in the dry air. You pull the thick cloak further up over your ears, muffling the sporadic groans of the timber frame and isolating yourself. Your mind begins to drift, not toward rest, but into that strange waking fugue state, born of physical exhaustion and relentless cold. You remember the smell of the turned earth from the morning, the rich, dark scent of the soil waiting patiently beneath the frost. The memory of the labor brings a strange, comforting solidity to the disorienting, endless night. Can you imagine the immense discipline required to lie still while the cold constantly tests your resolve? Beyond the heavy oak door, the valley floor lies buried under an unbroken, pristine layer of hard-packed snow. The moon, hidden behind the thick canopy of winter clouds, casts no light to reveal the changed landscape of the settlement. The dirt tracks, the stone well, the crumbling Roman masonry all are erased, swallowed by the uniform, freezing white shroud. The neighboring houses stand as dark, silent mounds, their inhabitants engaged in the identical, isolated struggle to preserve their core heat until morning. It is a communal battle fought in utter solitude, a paradox of shared suffering that binds the valley together without a single word spoken. You feel a dull throbbing behind your eyes, a headache born of dehydration, and the subconscious clenching of your jaw against the chill. You run a dry tongue over your cracked lips, tasting the faint metallic residue of the well water you drank hours ago. The urge to rise and break the ice in the bucket for another swallow is strong, but the prospect of leaving the meager warmth of the bed is paralyzing. You weigh the discomfort of the thirst against the brutal shock of the freezing air, ultimately deciding to endure the dry ache. You swallow hard, forcing your mind to detach from the physical sensations and retreat deeper into the protective shell of your own thoughts. The heavy, pungent odor of the sheep filters through the partition once again, carried on a microscopic shift in the room's stagnant airflow. The smell is a raw, unrefined testament to life, a vital presence that pushes back against the sterile, odorless cold of the deep night. A rat scurries along the upper wall plate, its tiny claws clicking a rapid, chaotic rhythm against the frozen oak timber. The sound travels directly over your head, a brief burst of frantic energy that quickly fades into the far corner of the ceiling. The wildlife of the valley does not recognize the boundary of the human dwelling, seeking refuge wherever the frost is slightly less lethal. In this era, the line between the wild and the domestic was often as thin as a single wooden plank. You press your hands flat against your chest, feeling the measured thump of your heart beneath the coarse wool tunic. The rhythm is reassuring, a persistent internal drumbeat, proving that the body's central furnace continues to burn despite the surrounding freeze. You trace the woven pattern of the blanket resting over your sternum, the rough yarn catching on the rougher skin of your fingertips. The tactile engagement keeps you anchored, preventing the suffocating darkness from overwhelming your weary senses. You know the night cannot last forever, but in these deepest, hushed hours, time ceases to possess any real meaning. It is merely a void that must be occupied until the light returns. Frost has undoubtedly thickened across the iron latch of the door, welding the metal to the wood in a temporary icy bond. The banked coals in the hearth are fighting a losing battle against the encroaching chill, the protective layer of ash barely preserving the vital embers. Every element of the house is slowly surrendering to the ambient temperature of the valley, a relentless thermal drain that cannot be stopped. The silence inside the room is no longer just the absence of noise, it has become a physical pressure, a heavy blanket pressing against the eardrums. The deep night holds the village in a state of suspended animation, a frozen breath held tightly against the dark. You turn your head to the side, the dried bracken in the pillow ticking loudly, a harsh crunching noise in the hushed space. The rough linen scrapes against your cheek, smelling of dust and the bitter herbs used to repel lice during the summer months. You pull your knees up closer to your chest, curling into the tightest possible knot to minimize the surface area exposed to the freezing sheets. A sharp ache settles into the base of your spine, the consequence of hours spent hunched over the heavy grinding stones at the river. You endure the pain in silence, knowing there is no remedy available in the dark, frozen expanse of the dwelling. The leather harness you repaired earlier hangs stiffly from its peg, the thick tallow grease frozen solid within the tough animal hide. Come morning, the straps will need to be worked by hand near the fire before they can be fitted to the ox for hauling timber. The cycle of maintenance and labor defines the existence here, a relentless turning of the wheel that demands every ounce of human effort. Worn iron, cracked wood, and calloused hands are the true currency of the valley, traded daily for the simple right to draw another breath. The shadows conceal these vital implements now, allowing them to rest alongside the exhausted bodies of the villagers. The true weight of the winter was not measured in snow, but in the silence it forced upon the world. You let out a long, ragged exhale, the white plume of your breath dissipating into the freezing darkness hovering above the bed. The urge to stretch your cramped legs is overwhelming, but the memory of the agonizing muscle spasm keeps you locked in your defensive posture. You listen for the wind, hoping the storm has not returned to batter the vulnerable thatch roof with fresh fury. The silence holds, vast and unyielding, offering no clues about the state of the frozen world beyond the heavy oak door. You close your eyes, forcing your mind to count the slow, measured beats of your own heart, a simple rhythm to ward off the encroaching dread. Air seeping through the microscopic cracks in the daub feels like physical ice against the exposed skin of the face. The temperature has reached its nadir, the lowest point of the long night where the earth itself seems to freeze solid. Water in the wooden bucket near the hearth has formed a thick, impenetrable crust, the iron ladle locked firmly within the frozen surface. The very structure of the house feels brittle, the timber joints groaning under the sheer stress of the plummeting cold. This is the hour that tests the limits of the human body, stripping away all illusions of comfort and leaving only the raw instinct to survive. You tuck your chin firmly against your collarbone, utilizing the thick wool of your cloak to shield your raw throat from the ambient chill. The lingering scent of the turnip broth from the evening meal has vanished, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the winter air. You imagine the pale grey light that will eventually break over the eastern ridge, a distant promise that currently feels impossible to reach. You shift your weight a fraction of an inch, the straw mattress rustling loudly, a deafening sound in the suffocating stillness of the room. You clench your fists beneath the blankets, fighting the involuntary shivers that threaten to consume your remaining energy. The isolation of the settlement ensures that no help will arrive if the winter proves too harsh for the fragile wooden walls. Every family is an island, locked within their own boundaries, fighting their own private wars against the frost and the gnawing hunger. The crumbling Roman roads leading out of the valley are impassable, buried under drifts of snow that will not melt for months. The world has shrunk to the dimensions of the single room, a cramped, freezing universe defined by the hearth, the bed, and the door. The vast empires of history mean nothing here, replaced entirely by the immediate crushing reality of the cold. You reach out from beneath the wool for just a brief second, testing the air temperature with your bare knuckles before retreating. The brief exposure feels like plunging your hand into a stream of mountain runoff, a shocking, biting cold that sears the skin. You pull the thick blanket back over your head, trapping your own warm breath to thaw the sudden numbness in your fingers. The physical toll of just lying still in this climate is immense, a passive labor that drains the body's reserves as surely as swinging an axe. You wait, your eyes open to the dark, counting the agonizingly measured passage of time in the frozen room. The violent howling that dictated the rhythm of the night finally breaks, snapping abruptly like a massive, over-tensioned hemp rope. The sudden cessation of the wind leaves a ringing vacuum in the small wooden house, an absence of sound so profound it feels like a physical pressure pushing against your eardrums. You listen intently to the stillness, waiting for the gale to return and rattle the heavy oak shutters with renewed fury. Minutes stretch outward in the pitch black, but the surrounding valley remains locked in absolute, unbroken silence. The worst of the winter storm has passed over the ridge, leaving the settlement buried under a crushing weight of fresh, heavy snow. This sudden calm marks the turning point of the deep night, the exact moment when the desperate fight against the elements transitions into a slow, quiet endurance. You feel the rigid tension holding your muscles together begin to crack and dissolve into the freezing air. The tight defensive notch you formed beneath the heavy blankets slowly unfurls, your cramped legs extending inch by careful inch down the length of the narrow bed. Your toes brush against the smooth surface of the wrapped riverstone, a familiar texture that no longer shocks the numb skin at the extremities. You let your shoulders drop away from your ears, the stiff joints in your upper neck popping faintly in the hushed space. The physical relief is immediate and overwhelming, a heavy wave of pure exhaustion that washes through your bloodstream and settles deep into your marrow. The body recognizes that the immediate threat of the storm has passed, granting permission to finally surrender its exhausting vigilance. Muffled, rhythmic breathing drifts through the timber partition from the adjoining byre, a slow and steady metronome anchoring the heavy silence. The sheep have sensed the dramatic shift in the weather, their restless shifting replaced by the collective stillness of deep, uninterrupted slumber. The scent of their thick fleece and warm bodies seems to thicken in the stagnant air, an earthy, oily aroma that provides a strange, vital comfort in the dark. You press your hand flat against the wooden wall beside the mattress, absorbing the faint, lingering vibrations of their massive breathing presence. The shared boundary between human and animal dissolves in the blackness, leaving only a unified resistance against the bitter chill pressing on the outer walls. The isolation feels significantly less absolute when measured against the steady rise and fall of living lungs in the very next room. Across towns like this, people learn to listen to the silence of the snow, recognizing it as the only true sanctuary the harsh winter ever offered. You turn your head slowly on the straw-stuffed pillow, the dried bracken rustling with a dry, harsh scrape against the coarse linen. Your eyes stare toward the center of the room, finding no trace of the faint red glow that marked the active hearth hours ago. The thick layer of grey ash has smothered the remaining embers, sealing the vital thermal energy away to ensure it survives until the dawn. The smell of cold smoke and charred pine hangs heavy near the floorboards, a dormant promise of fire waiting patiently for the strike of a flint. You realize the house has held its ground against the elements, the ancient oak timbers proving stronger than the crushing pressure of the violent gale. The primitive architecture of the dwelling has executed its single purpose, preserving the fragile spark of life within its muddy plastered walls. The temperature inside the room stabilizes, reaching a harsh equilibrium with the frozen earth directly beneath the foundation stones. You pull the rough hem of the wool blanket down slightly, exposing your face to the biting metallic tang of the stagnant atmosphere. The cold no longer feels like an aggressive entity actively searching for a weakness in your carefully constructed woolen defenses. It has become a neutral, passive fact of existence, a heavy medium through which every single breath must be deliberately drawn. You inhale deeply, the freezing oxygen burning the back of your throat before filling your lungs with a clean, sharp clarity. The pain of the chill fades into a dull, manageable ache, accepted by the mind as the necessary, unavoidable cost of winter survival. You trace the woven pattern of the heavy blanket with your calloused thumb, your movements slow and deliberate in the blind dark. The uneven yarn catches against the thick scars on your knuckles, a tactile map of the countless hours spent swinging the heavy iron hoe. The memory of the morning's intense labor rises in your mind, stripped of its agonizing effort and reduced to a series of rhythmic, purposeful motions. You picture the dark clods of frozen earth turning over, the smell of the hidden soil hitting the crisp, freezing air of the valley. The work anchors you to this specific patch of land, a silent contract written in sweat and measured in harvested grain. The dirt waiting patiently beneath the deep snow holds the promise of the coming spring, a distant but inevitable reward for enduring the current freeze. Shadows seem to lose their threatening edge, blending seamlessly into the uniform blackness that fills the cramped dimensions of the house. The frantic waking fugue-ray state that gripped your mind during the height of the storm slowly ebbs away, replaced by a heavy narcotic sluggishness. You stop trying to calculate the remaining hours until sunrise, allowing the rigid concept of time to slip away into the empty void. The agonizing need to monitor every draft and creaking floorboard dissolves, surrendering to the profound stillness of the buried, isolated valley. You let your jaw go slack, the dull throbbing in your temples fading as the unconscious, defensive clenching finally comes to an end. The deep night requires nothing more from you now. The toll has been paid in full, and the debt of survival is settled for the hour. You focus on the steady beat of your own heart, the thumping rhythm vibrating faintly against your ribs and echoing in your inner ears. The sound is slow and powerful, a relentless engine driving the sluggish blood through your chilled extremities to keep the frostbite at bay. You feel a deep, resonant warmth beginning to build in the center of your chest, a core temperature guarded fiercely by the surrounding layers of homespun wool. The heavy garments and piled blankets press down with an immense comforting gravity, pinning you securely to the unyielding surface of the straw mattress. The world outside the heavy oak door has ceased to matter entirely, locked away behind walls of timber and frozen snow. The perimeter of your existence has shrunk to the exact dimensions of the narrow wooden bed resting in the dark. What would you have given to know that the hardest part of the long, dark winter was already behind you? You slide your left hand beneath the covers, resting the palm flat against your stomach to trap the ambient heat generated by your own body. The raw, jagged scratch from the morning's labor throbs with a distant, muted pulse beneath the thick layer of greasy comfrey salve. The sharp, medicinal scent of the crushed root mixes with the dusty odor of the straw ticking, creating an olfactory signature unique to this specific moment. You allow the localized pain to fade into the background noise of the exhausted muscles, a minor complaint ignored by a mind seeking absolute rest. The body's natural capacity to adapt to suffering takes over, numbing the sharpest edges of the physical reality and smoothing the path toward unconsciousness. The relentless demands of the freezing flesh are finally quieted by the sheer weight of the accumulated bone-deep fatigue. Tiny microscopic shifts in the architecture of the house occur as the extreme cold locks the timber joints into their final rigid positions for the night. A single drop of water, melted by the residual heat of the chimney stones hours ago, finally freezes solid with a faint, crystalline click. You hear the sound clearly, a tiny punctuation mark at the end of a long, chaotic sentence written by the violent winter storm. The silence that follows is thicker and more profound than before, a vast ocean of quiet that swallows every remaining conscious thought. You breathe out a long, slow sigh, the invisible vapor rising to meet the freezing air before vanishing into the shadows above. The resistance is over, the long battle against the deep night concluding in a silent, mutual truce between the human and the frost. You let the heavy, suffocating darkness pour over you, no longer a hostile force to be fought, but a protective shroud offering total concealment. The boundary between the cold air in the room and the skin on your face becomes indistinct, the temperatures merging into a single, uniform sensation. The hard, packed earth floor beneath the bed frame feels less like a freezing threat and more like a solid, unwavering foundation holding you safe. You release your grip on the frayed edge of the blanket, your fingers going limp against the coarse, fibrous material of the spun yarn. The mind begins to detach from the physical senses, drifting untethered through the empty, silent space of the windowless room. The transition is seamless, a slow sinking into the heavy, waiting waters of the final, peaceful hour. The village outside rests under a massive, unbroken blanket of white, the individual houses resembling nothing more than gentle swells in the frozen earth. You imagine the neighboring families lying in identical darkness, their breathing synchronized in the vast, shared quiet of the isolated settlement. The communal struggle against the starvation and the frost binds the valley together with invisible threads stronger than any crumbling Roman masonry. The people here do not conquer the landscape, they learn its brutal rhythms and find ways to exist within the narrow margins of its mercy. You feel a profound sense of belonging to this silent, enduring collective, a nameless participant in the long, unrecorded history of the deep winter. The shared endurance brings a unique kind of peace, a comforting knowledge that you are not facing the vast void entirely alone. You notice the scent of the room has settled into a permanent, complex tapestry that tells the story of the entire day's physical labor. The sharp tang of the raw iron tools near the door mixes with the earthy dust of the root cellar and the bitter sap of the burnt pine logs. The air is heavy and still, preserving these odors perfectly in the freezing temperature, creating an olfactory museum of survival and endurance. You breathe it in without resistance, the familiar smells grounding you in the absolute safety of the enclosed, fortified space. The harshness of the environment is forgotten, replaced by the profound, simple luxury of lying perfectly still while the world outside remains frozen. The mind no longer needs to process threats or plan for the coming dawn. It only needs to exist in the current, quiet moment. You sink deeper into the rustling straw of the mattress, the tough, dried stalks yielding to the heavy, relaxed weight of your tired spine. The rough linen sheet covering the ticking no longer feels like a sheet of ice, but rather a firm, supportive layer holding you safely above the cold floor. The darkness behind your closed eyelids perfectly matches the pitch black of the room, creating an illusion of infinite, empty, and peaceful space. The persistent, dull ache in your lower back slowly dissolves, melting away into the coarse fabric and leaving only a comfortable, heavy numbness. You give yourself over entirely to the gravity pulling you down, a willing surrender to the profound exhaustion that has earned this deep rest. The night has finally released its punishing grip, offering the brief, vital sanctuary of the hours before the grey light returns. The exact, brittle snap of a single unseen ember collapsing into grey dust echoes faintly from the bottom of the stone hearth. The specific, coarse texture of the homespun wool presses heavily against the sensitive skin at the bridge of your nose. A localized, faint draft shifts the stale air, carrying the precise scent of dried winter cabbages up from the hidden root cellar beneath the floorboards. The wooden stool near the fire emits a microscopic, dry creak as the cooling timber fibers contract tightly around the carved joints. The heavy, oily aroma of lanolin from the adjoining byre settles thickly onto the back of your tongue with every slow inhalation. The steady, unyielding gravity pulls the tension from your collarbone, pressing your shoulders deep into the crushed, dusty bracken. The absolute stillness of the frozen valley presses against the exterior oak walls, a vast, silent weight sealing the house in perfect isolation. The boundary between the freezing room and the quiet mind finally dissolves into the heavy, motionless air. You close your eyes. The winter holds its breath for you now. Return when you are ready to walk the old paths once more.